Peter Singer is regarded by many as the world's most influential living philosopher. His writings have inspired people to think deeply about how they can lead a more ethical life. But Singer's conclusions have sometimes been controversial. He's best known for his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, where he argues the ethical case against eating meat. That work has helped shape the animal rights movement. Singer's ideas about our ethical obligation towards people in extreme poverty have helped inspire the effective altruism project. It calls on people in rich countries to donate heavily to improve the lives of others in the developing world. Singer calls himself a consequentialist, believing that actions should be judged by their consequences. He hopes his work helps others understand the impact of their own actions on the world and provide practical answers about how to make it a better place for everyone. Basil Rahan, The InnerView.
And Peter Singer joins us now on The InnerView. I'm delighted to have him on the program. Peter, good to have you on the show. It's been a while since we last chatted. I think a lot of people might agree that we have economic crises, ecological crises, political crises across the world. But I think where they would differ is if they are asked if there's a moral or ethical crisis.
I do believe that we have, yes, or you could say more than one. Certainly, you've already mentioned the ecological crisis, but the ecological crisis is also a moral crisis, because if we, this generation, continue to selfishly use fossil fuels and eat meat, which is high in greenhouse gas emissions, then we are wronging future generations, and we are wronging people living in poorer countries who are less able to cope with the impact, and particularly people living in tropical countries or countries that are already very hot. So that's one moral issue. I also think that in failing to deal with global poverty, people who are affluent are doing something that's wrong. So you could say that's another moral crisis. And I regard our treatment of animals, and particularly the huge numbers, hundreds of billions of animals in factory farms that we continue to exploit, as another moral crisis.
Mm. There are a bunch of these things to look at, right? And you mentioned a long list. And when we talk about people's personal responsibility, and beyond that, even a collective responsibility, is it a case of people not knowing, or people knowing but not caring, or maybe people knowing that something needs to be done but feeling powerless in the face of it?
I think it varies who you're talking about. With regard to climate, most people know that we are causing climate change, and they know that that will have disastrous consequences for our grandchildren, perhaps even our children, perhaps even some of us. But I think there we are too selfish, or perhaps we don't care enough about these future generations to change our practices in the way that we need to. With regard to animals, I would say perhaps not everybody realizes or understands just how bad conditions are for animals in factory farms, or perhaps they don't even really know that most of the meat produced in the developed world particularly comes from animals who are confined indoors all their lives. Perhaps they imagine that these animals are still having pleasant lives out in the field, which is certainly not the majority of them. So it can vary, I think, as to whether it's selfishness, indifference to others, or ignorance.
Yeah, and I guess to the point of feeling as if people on an individual level cannot do enough to make any critical difference. Two of the issues that you mentioned, the fossil fuel industry and animal agriculture, essentially drive our global civilization. So when you're up against the Leviathan that big, do you sympathize with those who say, well, I mean, what can I do as an individual? How much can I actually do?
It's true that individuals can't do a great deal, but it is the cumulative impact of actions by billions of individuals that is causing the problem. So I feel that we should say, well, I will try to play my part in working towards a solution and a better future for the planet. And therefore, I will, both in my personal choices, what I consume, and also as a politically active person. Um, this applies obviously particularly to democratic societies, but it applies to other countries as well. I will be active in calling for my political leaders to take the drastic action that is needed to be taken to find a solution.
No political leader, no religious leader, very few individuals claim to be heartless. Every single one that you might speak to would say, yes, I am altruistic. Yes, I am compassionate. So with that in mind, let's work on a definition here. Give me the definition as understood and propagated by Peter Singer on how to be altruistic, compassionate, or effectively altruistic, as you say.
I think we should be aware of the consequences of everything we do for others. And others here includes not just people close to us, but people who are far away from us, geographically far away from us, perhaps, if they're in other countries, far away from us in time, perhaps, if we're thinking about people in the next century living with the consequences of climate change. And also far from us in terms of not even being members of our species, but still being sentient beings capable of feeling pain. So I think we should live our lives to think about what it would be like to be those others. And if we think of ourselves as living their lives as well as our own, and then ask ourselves, what would be best for all of us, others as well as myself, I think that will direct us to live an ethical life, because I think that requires us to take into account all of those others.
Right. And doing the bare minimum. So, for example, if somebody maybe donates a small amount of money to refugees in a far-off land, is there some way in which that psychologically maybe absolves you of any further or deeper responsibility? I'm reminded of the Tolstoy quote, I sit on a man's back, choking him, making him carry me, and I convince myself and assure myself and him and others that I'm very sorry for him and I'm doing everything in my power to help him, except by getting off his back, right? So I wonder if that kind of altruism is built into our culture, where you feel as if, okay, I gave a bit of money, I gave a bit of a donation, which then stops you from any deep fundamental change in a society or in the world. So you give some money to the refugees, but you do nothing to maybe try and impact stopping the war that created the refugee. Is there something to be said about that?
It depends whether we really can do something about stopping the war or the cause of the problem. If, let's say, we're talking about refugees from Ukraine at present, it's very hard to know what anyone other than those who are in leadership positions, either in Ukraine or in the NATO nations that are assisting Ukraine, it's hard to know what they can do to stop the war. So there, I think, donating to help refugees, or perhaps if you're in a country where there are many refugees, trying to help refugees, trying to provide housing for them, those are the best things you can do. I think we always need to think of what difference we can actually make. And certainly if we think that just giving a small donation is all we need to do, then I don't think that's enough. It may depend on how much we can afford, how wealthy we are, but I think we should be doing substantial things. I think it should be an important goal of ours, not just a trivial thing that we give a small donation and think that now we can just get on with living our lives as normal. That's not going to solve the problem.
Can you ever justifiably be compassionate and altruistic while waging war? Is there ever any justification for it in trying to stop the root cause of evil?
Well, if you're waging a defensive war against aggression, as I believe Ukraine is today, then yes, you can be compassionate. You can say that it's necessary to do this. If we don't, the world will get worse for many other people. So we must wage war, but we should do it in a way that causes the least harm, and particularly the least harm to civilians. You can't help causing harm to enemy soldiers when they're invading your country and shooting at you, but you can try to avoid causing harm to civilians. So yes, you still can be compassionate if you are waging a war that is not one of your making, but one that is thrust upon you.
Is that how you would explain it in the utilitarian way, from the utilitarian perspective, where you can't have absolute morals, but you need to try to determine how you can do the most amount of good and the least amount of harm? So in this case, sometimes you have to choose a lesser evil?
Yes, that's correct. The utilitarian view is one that looks at the consequences of our actions, and if the consequences of not resisting aggression would be that that aggression continues and expands to other countries, then, as well as harming the people in your own country, of course, then it may be that the lesser evil is to fight back and to try to kill the enemy soldiers who are invading your country. That's very regrettable, and it's sad that it's forced upon you, but it may be a justifiable thing to do.
Is there any political stripe or avenue in this world right now, or any movement that you find is most consistent with your values and maybe lands you on that political spectrum or that cultural spectrum? Is there anything you look at and you say, yeah, I like that, I like what they're doing, and that's in line with my values?
Well, I do like what the effective altruism movement is doing, and I say that knowing that some of my writing has played a role in getting that movement going. But I'm delighted to see quite a large number of younger people making effective altruism an important part of their lives. That means not only being altruistic and trying to make the world a better place in the sense that I outlined before, but also making sure that what you do is as effective as possible. So whatever resources you have, we talked about donations, so it may be money, it may be time that you're volunteering to do something, but do it as effectively as you can. Get the best value for your money. Just as when we're consumers, if we need to buy a new phone or a car or something of that sort, we do a bit of research and we try to find how to get the best value for our money. So in terms of what we're doing to make the world better, to donate to charities, I think we ought to be as effective as possible. We ought to want to get the best value for our money too, even when we're giving to help others, not only when we're buying a consumer item for ourselves.
And when you come across people who idealistically and ideologically want to make the world a better place with all-encompassing theories. I mean, we saw the worst of it in the 20th century with the Nazis, with Bolshevism in many ways, where the end goal was to make the world a better place. They felt that they needed to do certain things along that way, eliminate such enemies, class enemies, racial enemies, and the like to get there. How do you clearly distinguish the effective altruism trying to make the world a better place from the ideological approaches to this, where we want to create utopia, we need to break a few eggs to make this omelet?
Yes, I would distinguish actually Nazism from Bolshevism or communism, because Nazism, I think, wanted to make things better for Germans or for the so-called Aryan race. They were not really interested in the well-being of certainly not of Jews or of Slavs for that matter. And there's speeches by Himmler saying he doesn't care whether 10,000 Slavs die in digging a trench for Germany as long as the trench is dug. Whereas communism, for all the terrible things that happened, particularly under Stalin, you have to say that as an ideology, it was aiming at good for everybody. But of course, it was distorted dreadfully, and essentially the theory didn't work anyway. I think the theory was contrary to strong aspects of human nature that did not change when the economy changed, as Marx had thought it would. So I think that's part of the problem. But also, I would say that ideologies tend not to be sufficiently pragmatic. They don't. They're not flexible. They become rigid, and they don't look at facts that fly in the face of the ideology. And that was certainly the problem with Marxism.
And do you fear that anything that you might have inspired might create some sort of inflexible ideological approach among followers, supporters?
I'm aware of that possibility, yes, and I suppose I do my best to guard against it, but one can never be completely sure that what you say or write is not going to get distorted. And maybe people will do things that they shouldn't. I think the collapse of the cryptocurrency exchange FTX can be attributed to the possibility that Sam Bankman-Fried, who was part of the effective altruism movement, thought that it justified him in breaching the trust of his customers and using the funds they had deposited with him to try to bring one of his other ventures out of a difficult financial situation. And that proved to be disastrous for him and for the depositors and for the people he might have benefited by the immense wealth that he had, if only he had followed the sort of basic moral principles and not breached the trust of his customers.
How did that feel when it all blew up and your name was associated with it, or your movement was associated with it?
Well, it didn't feel good, I have to tell you. It was immensely disappointing, I would say, and such a shame and such a waste, really, that somebody who had many billions of dollars, and I think was at least initially genuinely going to do good with them, going to find effective causes, and had started already giving some over 100 million anyway to effective causes, had firstly behaved badly and therefore brought the whole effective altruism movement into some degree of disrepute. And secondly, as I say, there was just that terrible waste that he could have done so much good with the money he had without doing anything dishonest, without taking some of the risks that he took, perhaps. But it was wasted.
Has it damaged the movement?
I would have to accept that it's been a setback to the movement, at least a temporary setback. I hope that it will only be a short-term setback. But yes, there were a number of critical articles written and critical things said about effective altruism, that it had led to Bankman-Fried acting in this way. So sure, I would accept that it has been a setback.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned cryptocurrencies and that world. These emerging dynamics that people are struggling to understand but are inextricably involved in, whether you like it or not. One of those things, or a couple of those things connected to that, happen to be bioengineering and artificial intelligence. Chatbots that emerge. Some people, I mean, you can bury your head in the sand and say, I don't want to engage with this, but ultimately it's part of the reality or the cosmology that we're living within right now. Are you afraid of what's emerging right now?
Afraid is maybe too strong. I'm watching it with some degree of concern. I don't think that the chatbots that we have are all that threatening. I think some people think that somehow, because they're chatting with it and it seems like chatting with a conscious being, that somehow we've created a conscious artificial intelligence or even an artificial general intelligence. But we haven't. I mean, there's a much simpler explanation of what's going on with the chatbots. But certainly, artificial intelligence is advancing quickly. We don't know exactly where it's going, and it is certainly going to be disruptive. It is going to put people out of work. Hopefully, they will find other work because it is also very productive. And in the past, we've had machines that have put people out of work, automation, but in the long run, they've been beneficial. So we can hope that artificial intelligence will be too, but we can't be completely confident that it will be. That there is a problem there.
Yeah, let me give you one of the thought experiments I've had. or maybe this is just a fear of mine, and I'm using this as an opportunity for therapy, maybe. If one could imagine artificial intelligence adopting a skewed version of utilitarianism, right? So with the utilitarian philosophy, you have a bunch of these examples, anecdotes, the drowning girl and not wanting to spoil your shoes, whether you smother the baby and allow the soldiers to come in and kill everybody else by not smothering the baby when the baby cries. The trolley problem people have spoken about. A trolley could fork off in one of two directions. You can press a button and it kills one innocent person, or you leave it alone and it might kill, I don't know, 50 innocent people. These are philosophical conundrums that a lot of people have. I wonder if we introduce AI into our political decision making and AI calls the shots, what's to say that AI doesn't say, well, to save 100,000 people, we're going to kill 10 million people. To save 10 people, we might kill 100,000 people. Does that factor into your thinking when you think of taking artificial intelligence and using it to inform our decisions in a moral, ethical, political sense?
Well, in the examples you gave, the artificial intelligence is not being utilitarian; it's being the reverse of it, right?
Tell me why.
Sorry, I thought if I understood correctly, you were saying that the artificial intelligence was going to kill 100,000. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it might kill
100,000 people by killing 10
so,
million.
Yeah, sorry, saving 100,000 people. Yeah, so or killing 100,000 people to save 10 million people, for example.
Yeah, but if that is the only way to save 10 million people, then I think that's the right thing to do.
Really?
I don't object to that. Yeah, because it's. I think it doesn't make much difference whether somebody is killed or whether somebody is allowed to die. If you say we have to let these 10 million people die because it's wrong to kill 100,000, and if the 100,000 and the 10 million, they're identical populations, there's no other relevant differences between them, then I think that the right thing to do is to reduce the number of people whose lives have to be ended in one way or another, either by being allowed to die or by being killed.
Do you have any reservations or fears about the cold-heartedness of AI coming in to make the decisions that humans should be wrestling with and debating?
Well, I certainly think that humans should be looking at what the AI is doing, and no doubt we'll have intense discussions about how we might program AI if we ever get to this point where we have AIs either making decisions or advising leaders on decisions. So that's going to be a vigorous debate. But I think that perhaps humans make bad decisions in many respects, and an AI that is, you describe it as cold or cold-hearted, but it doesn't really have a heart. But it may make better decisions on the whole. I think there have been many tragic decisions that humans have made where we didn't do the right thing because we were, if you like, too reluctant to take an active step to harm somebody, even though if we didn't do that, many more people would be harmed.
Have you changed your mind on anything over the past 30, 40 years since you emerged in the public spotlight, since you started sharing your ideas through animal liberation and your other writings and speeches?
Oh, I've changed my mind on a number of issues. Yes, one of the difficult issues that comes up when we talk about the future is to what extent we should take into account beings who don't exist and may never exist. So this is one of the questions that is discussed in the effective altruism movement. Some people want to think about the very long-term future and think that we should be focusing on making sure that the species survives, because if the species survives, they say there could be vast numbers of people, quadrillions, quintillions of people living living in millions of years into the future. And So that raises the difficult question of, do we want to maximize the total number of people who will ever exist, assuming that they will have lives of positive quality? Or do we want to focus on those people who do exist now and who will exist irrespective of anything that we do? So,
Right.
as in the way that there will be people. So, I've gone back and forth on that issue. I still find it one of the most baffling issues. At one stage, I tried to argue we should only focus on those who exist or will exist anyway. Then I swung around to the fact that, well, future people can't, even if they're only possible people.
Right.
And I'm still somewhat uncertain on that question.
Well, if I had to put you on the spot and I had to ask you, or I had to give you the option of, you can reduce suffering or you can maximize the survival of the human species, and you can only choose one of those, which one would it be?
I need to know whether, if I maximize survival of the human species, that they will have good lives, that there will be a large number of people living good lives.
You wouldn't be able to know that.
Oh, I think then I would prevent the suffering now, because that would be a certainty of doing good. And if I have no probability estimates even of what the future will be like if humans survive, I don't know that I would be doing good at all.
No, it's good to have philosophers on the program. Peter Singer, pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us.